Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Nicholas Johnston. I'm the publisher of Axios. Thanks so much for joining us on a beautiful evening like this. This is our third day here at COP. We wouldn't be able to do this without all of you here joining it, and we certainly wouldn't be able to do it without the support of our partners. So I have a huge debt of gratitude for the folks at ClearPath for making tonight's conversation possible. And so I'm very happy to welcome up to the stage for a View from the Top conversation the CEO of ClearPath, Rich Powell. Rich Powell, come on down. Welcome to Axios House. Let's start maybe back closer to our hometowns in DC. For carbon management, there's been a lot of support in Congress for tax incentives. It was in the infrastructure bill. Starting from there, what's driving that?
Well, first, huge thanks for having us. Huge thanks for hosting this really important conversation. You know, I think carbon management is probably the most bipartisan place in the U.S. climate policy conversation right now across the Energy Act of 2020 and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and even the Inflation Reduction Act. Probably no technology received more investment than this. And I think that's probably, one, it starts with the science, right? So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and others have found that this is the need to have technology. So we need this to work at scale and at a reasonable cost if we've got any hope of stabilizing global temperatures and avoiding everything Lisa just talked about with sea level rise and loss of the small island states. And it's a technology where we could conceivably retrofit a lot of our existing infrastructure and frankly keep a lot of existing people employed in big parts, certainly of the US economy. And so I think it's been really appealing across the aisle.
And so a key element of that investment element in the technology is finding that price point. Tell us where, from your viewpoint, we are in that arc of trying to figure out, like, has the investment reached a level where the economics make sense? When do they begin to make more sense, and what's ahead for that?
Well, I think the investments are starting to speak for themselves. So in the US, this was a banner year for investment in carbon management technology. I think we'll see at the end of the year, but I think the record will show that after more gas, which is replacing coal, after more solar, carbon management will be the third largest set of investments in the U.S. economy, which I think indicates that the business models and the price points are emerging.
So that's driven by the economics, almost a tipping point, saying like now it's worth pouring more money into this because we're getting enough out of it.
That's right. So we've got significant, we've had the 45Q tax incentive, but that's now significantly more lucrative. We have major corporate commitments across the space. And we have significant cost share programs, for example, from the Department of Energy in carbon dioxide removal, in point source carbon capture, in the whole suite of things.
The technology is not without its critics, though. You'll be down at COP for the next couple of days. You'll probably run into people who are not as enthusiastic about it as you. What is your message to them? How do you win them over?
Well, we start with carbon dioxide removals. So I would argue that there may well already be too much CO2 in the atmosphere, that we're going to decide that we need to already start drawing it down. And if you just look at the inevitability that year on year we keep increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, we should slow that down and stop it as quickly as possible. But we've got all of this CO2 in the atmosphere.
Some net reduction needs to be in the equation.
We've got to do net reduction. So I think you start with that. That's just a reality. And then beyond that, there's lots of sectors of our economy. Take cement and concrete, for example. We just don't have many better options than carbon capture, use and storage to deal with a lot of the emissions from concrete and cement right now. I hope we'll have breakthrough technologies where people completely reimagine how to make cement and concrete. Some of those are on the drawing board in the lab scale, but usually they're making blocks of concrete about this big. And we make billions of tons of this stuff every year around the world. We need solutions to retrofit and control the existing industrial emissions.
So as you are, and as you continue to work to get people over to that side, then what is the next piece of that puzzle as far as doing this at scale? Because I remember, though, as you just said, like if we're having to get net reduction, that's a large amount of carbon that needs to be taken out. What needs to ramp up this?
Well, one thing that hugely needs to ramp up is the underlying infrastructure to store all this CO2. And so that means we're going to have a lot of places to store it. So we're going to have a lot of wells and sequestration sites around the world. We're going to have a lot of pipes and pipelines to move the stuff around everywhere. We're going to have the enabling policy regimes in the US and around the world to do all of that. And there's a lot of work left to do there. There's a lot of work on regulatory reform. There's a lot of work on getting the enabling infrastructure stood up that will support this whole network of technologies.
I mean, you're going to be walking the halls of COP probably with some of the members of Congress who are going to be flying into town after they're done voting. Many of them will probably support this. The message that you'll be giving, enforcing with them and bringing to others then is to do what? Is it more of that kind of all of the above approach that it requires additional investments, not just supporting the actual technology of that, but all the pieces, I guess, around it?
Well, first, important to note, I think we have the largest ever delegation of U.S. members of Congress coming to the COP this year, and certainly the largest ever bipartisan delegation coming. So we've got Republicans from the Energy and Commerce Committee that are leading a very large delegation, I think more than 20 total members coming over. So it's terrific to see this sort of bipartisan consensus that we ought to be here, that the U.S. ought to be at the table at COP, that there's a problem worth solving, and that we should have a discussion about that. And then in particular, as we're talking to those members about the next steps going forward, frankly, one of the biggest things that we need to enable this is permitting reform. So we need it to be easier for people to develop all of this enabling infrastructure. We need it to be easier and faster and more certain for people to do things like cite and sequester CO2. The Environmental Protection Agency, for example, has to issue permits for people to put the CO2 under the ground, and this EPA has not yet issued one of those permits. So we need to speed up that process.
Yeah, I want to circle right back to what the U.S. does, maybe on our way back home, but I want to take a very brief detour to the role coal plays in all of this. It's probably one of the most intractable problems, one of the dirtiest fuels, used so much in widespread around the world. How does the prevalence of that factor into how you make this argument and what kind of investment should be made in garbage management?
We can't escape coal at the moment. So large parts of the world, led by China, but also with India and Indonesia, they have massive coal reserves. They're very committed to developing and electrifying their own economies and building heavy infrastructure and industry in their economies. China has built a coal fleet twice the size of the entire U.S. power fleet. So 2 terawatts. The whole U.S. power fleet is 1 terawatt. And some of that will retire naturally, and some of that will be replaced with renewables and with nuclear and other zero-carbon sources. But if we don't have a technology, and I'm glad we're going to hear from Svante a little later on in the conversation, if we don't have a technology or a suite of technologies that can retrofit some big part of all those coal plants, many of which are brand new. The average age of a lot of these plants are 12 years old. If we don't have something that can control the carbon emissions from those, I don't see how the carbon math works. I don't see how we solve the equation.
So let's come back home before we have to wrap this up. You touched on this a little bit, but with those investments made in the United States, what needs to happen next? I mean, you mentioned permitting reform. What are the other things at the top of the list for you for implementation?
So absolutely permitting reform, absolutely a number of enabling things at the Department of Energy. So they've received this huge injection of resources from the bipartisan infrastructure law, for example. Now they've got to select projects and get dollars out the door. They've started that process with some of the carbon dioxide removal technologies, and so they've selected sites in Texas and Louisiana to get started on that. They've got a next round of this that they've got to do for power plants and industrial sites. They've got to get that out the door. They also have to start making investments in some hubs and some suites of enabling infrastructure, pipeline networks and whatnot. So that's another major priority.
The legislation, maybe, that was the easy part. Now you have to do the work.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's hard to do it at the scale and the speed that we need it to happen. The Department of Energy is rising to the moment. They're hugely staffing up. They're making a lot of smart choices about these things, and there's not a lot of margin for error. And they have a mixed track record in the past of executing really well on big projects, especially in this space.
So we're about to get the hook here. Our tradition at Axios is to end on a one fun thing. We've made that a one Dubai thing here. This is our first time here. This is your first newbie?
Fifth time.
Fifth time here? Okay, so for us people here who just got off the plane in Dubai, what do we got to do before we go home?
This is a bit of a stretch because it's in the Emirates, not in Dubai, but people should go down the road to Abu Dhabi where there is a Louvre that they've built and associated with the original Louvre. And in that Louvre, you can see the first map of the entire world.
That's a good tourist trip.
You should see that.
Excellent. Rich, thanks so much for being here, and thanks to ClearPath for making today possible.
Thanks for having me.